The first thing you need to know is that Nora Whitfield was not a woman who asked for help. Not because she was proud, not because she was stubborn in the way people mean when they say a woman is difficult, but because she had learned in 28 years of living on the Kansas prairie that asking for help from the wrong people cost more than the help was worth. She had learned that the hard way, the way most things worth knowing get learned. It was November of 1884 when her neighbors first noticed something strange happening at the Whitfield cabin. A woman climbing down from a wagon with bolts of rope. A woman standing on a wooden chair pressing her ear against the log wall as if she expected it to speak. A woman hammering wooden pegs into the timber at regular intervals, spacing them out with the kind of precision that did not belong to grief and did not belong to madness, but belonged to something else entirely. Something that looked from a distance almost like a plan. The prairie wind came down from the north that November without mercy. It came across 500 miles of open grassland, picking up speed and coldness as it went. And by the time it reached the Whitfield homestead, it carried the kind of chill that did not just touch your skin. It went straight through to the bone and settled there a permanent resident. Most women in that situation would have wrapped themselves in every quilt they owned and huddled close to the stove. Nora Whitfield was hanging her quilts on the walls. She was standing on that wooden chair in the gray light of a Kansas morning, her breath making small clouds that disappeared into the cold air, and she was driving wooden pegs into the north wall of her cabin at 5-centimeter intervals, spacing them with her thumb, working from left to right, top to bottom, methodical and quiet and completely alone. She had not lit the stove yet. It was 32 degrees inside the cabin. Her fingers were stiff and her joints ached, and she kept going anyway because stopping was not an option she was willing to consider. The quilt she was about to hang was the one her grandmother had made. 40 years old, blue and cream and pale yellow, the colors faded soft by time. It was the most beautiful thing Nora owned. It was also, she had decided, the most useful thing she owned. And on that cold November morning, usefulness had to win. She pressed the first corner of the quilt to the peg and stepped back to check the spacing. Not flat against the wall, not touching the logs. Exactly 5 centimeters of air between the fabric and the timber. That gap mattered. That gap was the entire idea. She did not know yet if the idea would work. She knew that she would die if it did not. 2 months earlier, Samuel Whitfield had been alive. He had been 35 years old, broad-shouldered, slow to anger, and deeply in love with his wife, in the quiet way of a man who had never found words adequate to the feeling. He showed it instead in the way he repaired the loose hinge on the cabin door before Nora mentioned it twice, in the way he always left the warmest spot by the stove for her on cold mornings, in the way he had spent the last 2 years working that Kansas claim with the kind of stubborn optimism that the prairie either rewards or destroys, and he had not yet found out which. In September of 1884, Samuel Whitfield had been cutting firewood. It was ordinary work he had done 100 times. The axe came down, the wood split, the rhythm continued. And then somewhere in the middle of that ordinary afternoon, the axe slipped. It was a small slip, a momentary failure of grip, the kind that happens to careful men on the 100th repetition of a careful task. The blade caught his left hand along the base of the thumb. Deep, deep enough. He wrapped it himself. He did not want to worry Nora. That was the mistake that killed him. By the second day, the wound had turned red in a way that was not the red of healing. By the third day, it had turned a color that Nora had no name for, a dark and terrible color that she would spend the rest of her life trying to forget. The fever came with the third night, sudden and absolute, and it burned through Samuel Whitfield in 72 hours with an efficiency that left no room for prayer or remedy. The doctor came from Hartfield, 12 miles away. He came too late, and he knew it when he arrived, but he stayed through the night because he was a decent man, and because leaving felt like abandonment. Nora sat on one side of the bed, and the doctor sat on the other, and between them Samuel Whitfield burned away. He died on a Tuesday morning in September. The light through the cabin window was the particular gold of a Kansas autumn, warm and indifferent, and Nora sat holding his hand after it had gone still, and she did not move for a very long time. She had things to do. She knew she had things to do. The land claim required proof of continued occupancy through the following spring. The firewood pile stood half-finished in the yard, enough to last perhaps until Christmas, if she was careful, not enough to last until March, if she was not. The nearest neighbor was 2 miles away. The nearest town was 12 miles away. Winter was coming with the same indifference as that Tuesday morning light, and it was coming fast. But she did not move. Not yet. There was something she needed to remember first. 3 weeks before he died, on an evening when the first hint of autumn had crept into the air, Samuel had looked across the supper table at her with that quiet expression she knew meant he had been thinking about something important. "Nora," he said, "whatever happens with this place, whatever the winter brings." He stopped, searched for the right words, found them finally in the plainest ones available. A good man doesn't leave his wife choosing between her pride and her survival. She had not known then what he meant. She had told him nothing was going to happen, they were going to be fine, and she had believed it when she said it. Sitting beside his still body in the September morning light, she understood. He had not been making a prediction. He had been making a promise. The promise was this: whatever she needed to do to survive what was coming, she had his blessing in advance. She did not need to ask anyone's permission. She did not need to justify herself to anyone. She only needed to survive. That promise was the thing she carried out of that room. It was the most important thing he left her. She dried her eyes. She stood up. She went outside to look at the woodpile, and she started to calculate. October arrived, and with it, Harriet Voss. Harriet Voss was the wife of the Reverend Clement Voss, who led the congregation at the First Methodist Church of Hartfield, and she carried her position in that community with the particular weight of a woman who had never been uncertain about her own righteousness. She was 52 years old, tall, sharp-featured, with iron gray hair pulled back so tightly it seemed to hold her opinions in place. She had spent a lifetime visiting the homes of people in difficulty, and she had developed over those years a refined instinct for the difference between helping and managing, though she would not have recognized that distinction herself because in her experience, the two things were identical. She arrived at the Whitfield cabin on a Tuesday morning in a wagon driven by the Reverend's hired man, dressed in her good wool coat, carrying a basket covered with a cloth that concealed a fruit pie and a great deal of calculated sympathy. "My dear Mrs. Whitfield," she said, settling herself at Nora's table without being invited to sit, "we have all been so very concerned about you." Nora poured 2 cups of coffee. She set one in front of Harriet. She sat down across from her and said nothing because she had learned that silence was the most efficient way to find out what a person actually wanted. What Harriet actually wanted became clear within 4 minutes. There was a widower in Dodge City, a Mr. Aldous Pemberton, 58 years of age, owner of a hardware concern, financially stable, recently bereaved himself, and therefore Harriet implied with gentle precision, amenable to a practical arrangement with a young woman who found herself in difficult circumstances. "He is a church-going man," Harriet said. "Respectable. My husband knows him well. A letter of introduction could be arranged very easily." Nora drank her coffee. She understood exactly what was happening. She had understood it from the moment Harriet's wagon appeared at the end of the track. This was not charity. This was a transaction dressed as charity, and what Harriet was purchasing with her fruit pie, and her concern was the satisfaction of having been right that a woman alone could not manage a Kansas homestead through a hard winter. Right that the sensible solution was the solution Harriet herself was proposing. Accepting the offer would mean conceding the point. It would mean surrendering the land claim that Samuel had spent 2 years building. It would mean leaving Kansas carrying the label of a woman who could not manage alone, and that label, once attached, would follow her wherever she went. "I appreciate your concern, Mrs. Voss," Nora said. Her voice was even, warm even. "Please give my regards to the Reverend." A pause opened between them. "The winter will be severe," Harriet said. The warmth in her voice had cooled by half a degree. "A woman alone with insufficient firewood." "I'll manage," Nora said. "How precisely?" The question landed with a delicacy that was almost surgical. "You have what, half a cord stacked, perhaps less." "I have enough," Nora said, "and I'm working on the rest." This was not entirely true. She had the half cord Samuel had cut before the accident, and she had cut 3 more cords herself in the weeks since, working alone with an axe that was too heavy for her and getting better at it with each passing day. It was not enough. She knew it was not enough. She was still trying to figure out what to do about that when she walked into Gunderman's general store 3 weeks later and sat down next to an old woman who smelled of wood smoke and dried herbs and changed everything. Harriet Voss finished her coffee. She set the cup down with a small, precise click that communicated without a single word that she was not finished with this matter. "You know where to find me," she said, rising. "When you're ready to be sensible." She walked out of the cabin. The door closed behind her. Nora sat at the table and looked at the wall. The log wall, dark with age, with thin lines of daylight visible in the gaps between the timber where the chinking had cracked and dried and shrunk. As she watched a draft move through one of those gaps and set the candle flame on the table shuddering. She watched that shuddering flame until it steadied. Then she stood, cleared the cups from the table, and went to bed. She did not yet know what she was going to do. She knew only what she was not going to do, and that was enough for one evening. Gunderman's General Store on a Wednesday morning in November was cold enough that the breath of the three women waiting at the counter made small clouds above their bonnets. Franklin Gunderman kept the stove burning, but the store was large and poorly insulated, and the heat never quite reached the far corners, which was where Nora went to look at bolts of heavy canvas. She was calculating. She had been calculating for weeks now, running the same numbers in different orders, and arriving at the same conclusion: she did not have enough firewood to heat the cabin through March. Not at the rate the cabin currently lost heat. The logs bled warmth, the way a wound bleeds blood, steadily, constantly, the cold outside pulling it through the walls with a patience that was going to outlast her fuel supply. She could cut more wood. She had been cutting more wood. But cutting wood alone with the axe that had belonged to Samuel and was still slightly too heavy for her hands was slow work, and there was only so much of November left before the ground froze and the cutting became impossible. She needed another answer. She needed it soon. She was standing at the far corner of Gunderman's, running her thumb along a bolt of heavy canvas duck cloth and doing arithmetic in her head when she noticed the old woman. She was sitting in a straight-back chair near the cold corner wall, the coldest spot in the store, the spot everyone else avoided, with a cup of something hot wrapped between her hands. She was very old, 70 at least, with silver hair braided and coiled at the base of her neck, and the kind of face that had been weathered into something permanent and settled. Her clothes were plain and well-mended. She sat with the particular stillness of someone who had learned to be comfortable with her own company. Most people in Hartfield avoided Ingrid Larson. This was not a secret. She had arrived in Kansas 20 years ago with her husband, who had died within the first winter, and she had stayed. She spoke English with a Swedish accent that never softened. She kept to herself. She had opinions that she shared only when asked, and she was almost never asked because the community had decided early on that a foreign woman who lived alone and spoke little was probably not worth the effort of knowing. Nora had been watching Ingrid Larson from a distance for the better part of 2 years. She had noticed things. She had noticed that Ingrid's cabin burned less wood than any other homestead in the area, despite being no smaller. She had noticed that Ingrid was never one of the women huddled beside the church stove on Sunday mornings, shivering through their coats. She had noticed that Ingrid moved through the Kansas winter with a calmness that did not look like indifference or hardiness, but looked more like someone who had made a private arrangement with the cold, the terms of which everyone else was not privy to. Nora walked to the far corner. She sat down in the empty chair beside Ingrid Larson. She did not say hello or make apology for the intrusion. She simply sat and looked at the old woman and said, "Your cabin stays warm." Ingrid looked at her. The old woman's eyes were a pale, clear blue, the color of winter sky above the frost line, and they contained the kind of calm that comes not from disengagement, but from deep and settled certainty. "Yes," Ingrid said. "How?" A pause. Not the pause of someone deciding whether to share. The pause of someone deciding where to begin. "In Sweden," Ingrid said, "where I come from, the cold is very serious, more serious than here." A faint expression crossed her face that might have been amusement or might have been memory. "We learned long ago that fighting the cold does not work. The cold has more time than you do, more patience than you do. You cannot outburn it." "Then what?" Nora said. "You understand it," Ingrid said. "You learn what it needs in order to come inside, and then you take that thing away." She wrapped both hands more firmly around her cup, looked at the wall in front of her. "Heat moves," she said. "This is the thing most people do not think about clearly. Heat is always moving, always going somewhere. In a cold place, heat moves toward the cold. It goes through your walls, through your floors, through the gaps around your doors, and it goes into the air outside where it is lost. The cold does not come inside. The heat goes out. That is the correct way to think about it. Nora was very still. The fire in your stove, Ingrid continued. You are not heating your room. You are replacing the heat that is leaving. Every moment heat is leaving. The fire replaces it. If the heat leaves faster than the fire can replace it, you get cold. If the heat leaves very fast, you need much wood. So slow it down, Nora said. Yes. How air, Ingrid said simply. Still air. She set her cup down on the floor beside the chair and turned slightly to face Nora. Moving air takes heat away. This you know. Stand in the wind and you feel the cold. But air that does not move, air that is trapped, that cannot circulate that air, does nothing. It sits. It becomes what we call dead air. Dead air does not conduct heat well. It does not carry warmth away. It becomes instead a barrier, a wall of nothing that stops the heat from passing through. Nora looked at the wall of the store, at the log timber dark and cold. You hang fabric away from the wall, she said. It was not a question. It was the sound of something clicking into place. Not against it, away from it. So there is a gap. 5 centimeters, Ingrid said. Enough for the air to become still. Not too much, or the air circulates within the space and you lose the benefit. 5 centimeters and the fabric hangs straight, and the air between the fabric and the wall becomes dead. It cannot move. It holds the warmth in. And the doors, Nora said. Around the doors. A second curtain, Ingrid said. 90 centimeters inside the door. When the outer door opens, the cold air enters but hits the inner curtain. By the time anyone passes through both barriers, very little cold reaches the main room. In Uppsala, where I was a girl, we called it an airlock. Like on a ship, but for warmth. Nora sat with this for a moment. In her mind, she was walking through her cabin. The north wall where the wind hit hardest, where she could see daylight through the chinking gaps on bright days. The door which leaked cold air around its frame in a thin, persistent whistle. The south wall with its single window and its winter light. She was calculating. She had enough quilts. Her grandmother's, her mother's wedding gift, the one she and Samuel had bought in Wichita. She had canvas, she had rope, she had wooden pegs. She had 2 days of good weather left before the next storm front, according to the feeling in her knees, which had not been wrong yet. She stood up. Thank you, she said. Ingrid Larson looked up at her. The old woman's pale eyes held something that might have been surprise or might have been approval on a face that, careful, it was hard to tell the difference. You are the Whitfield widow, Ingrid said. Yes. They say you will not last the winter. They are wrong, Nora said. And she meant it the way you mean something when it is not hope but decision, the way you mean something when the alternative is not acceptable, and so the thing must simply be true. Ingrid nodded once, slowly. Come and find me, she said, if you have questions. Nora nodded. She picked up her canvas. She walked to the counter, paid Franklin Gunderman what she owed him, and went home to start the work. She worked for 2 days straight. The first morning, she drove pegs into the north wall, spacing them with her thumb at 5-centimeter intervals from the surface of the log, checking and rechecking the measurement until she was certain. She strung rope between the pegs to form a hanging rail. She lifted her grandmother's quilt, the blue and cream and pale yellow one, the one that was 40 years old and the most beautiful thing she owned, and she hung it. It fell straight and clean 5 centimeters from the wall. The gap between the fabric and the timber was precise and dark and still. She stood back and looked at it. The cabin looked strange. It looked like nothing she had ever seen in any homestead she had ever visited. It looked like the inside of a mind that had decided to be very strange in service of being very alive. She went back to work. Heavy quilts on the north wall where the Canadian wind came down without anything to stop it. Lighter quilts on the east and west walls. For the south wall, with its single window and its weak November sun, she chose a quilt that could be pulled to the side each morning, pinned back to let the light in, and released each evening to close the gap again. She cut strips of old wool blanket and pressed them into the doorframe, filling the gaps where the whistle of cold air had lived for 2 years. She hung a second curtain of heavy canvas, 90 centimeters inside the door, suspended from a rail she rigged with rope and 2 bent nails, and when she pulled it across and stepped back, She stood in the small vestibule between the two barriers and felt for the first time she could remember no draft at all. It was the second afternoon deep in the work, her hair coming loose and her hands raw from the rope, when Harriet Voss walked in. She did not knock. She opened the cabin door and stepped inside and stopped. She stared. "Good Lord," she said. "What in heaven's name have you done?" The cabin walls were covered in quilts. The doorway had grown a second curtain. The fabric hung everywhere in the dim afternoon light, colors softened by age, still and strange, and nothing like the interior of any home Harriet Voss had visited in a lifetime of visiting homes. "Insulating," Nora said. She was on the chair driving the last peg into the east wall, not turning around. "Those are your grandmother's quilts." "Yes. You have hung them on the wall like curtains, like decoration." "Not decoration." Nora drove the peg home with two firm strikes. "Insulation. Mrs. Whitfield." Harriet's voice carried the weight of a woman who had been designated by God and community to maintain standards. "Those quilts belong on beds. They belong folded in a chest. They are your grandmother's handiwork, and you are using them as wall coverings. And I will tell you plainly, that is a desecration of—" "My grandmother," Nora said, climbing down from the chair, "would rather keep me alive than be honored in a drawer." She faced Harriet across the strange quilt-draped room. She was not angry. Anger wastes heat, and she was done wasting anything. "Mrs. Voss," she said, "you are welcome to stay and help, or you are welcome to leave. But I do not have time for the other option." Harriet Voss drew herself up to her full height. The disapproval that radiated from her in that moment was physical in its intensity, a cold front of its own. "You will freeze," she said. "Before January you will come to me for help, and I want you to know that help will be available. I am not an uncharitable woman." "Come back in February," Nora said. "Then we will know." Harriet left. The door closed. The inner curtain swayed once and settled. Nora stood alone in her quilted cabin in the growing dark. She picked up her hammer. She drove the last peg. That evening she lit the stove for the first time since she had finished the work. She did it slowly and deliberately, the way you do something when you are testing a theory rather than just making yourself warm. She fed in small wood first, then larger pieces, building up carefully. She sat down in Samuel's chair, the one she had not moved because moving it had felt too final, and she waited. 1 hour. The room changed. It did not get warmer the way a room usually gets warmer, in that thin provisional way, where the warmth stays near the stove and loses conviction as it moves toward the walls. The whole room became warm, gradually, steadily, as if the walls had stopped pulling the heat away and were letting it accumulate. The quilts hung still. Behind them, in 5 centimeters of trapped darkness, the dead air was doing what Ingrid had promised it would do. The warmth was not escaping. It was staying. At 10 o'clock, she banked the stove low. She went to bed expecting to wake up cold. In the morning, the room was still warm. The fire had burned down to coals, red and quiet, barely enough to light the room. But the warmth that had built up the evening before had not gone anywhere. It had stayed held in by the dead air behind 40 years of quilts, and the morning air inside the cabin was the temperature of a room where someone had kept a good fire going all night. Nora sat on the edge of the bed and looked at the room for a long moment. She reached for Samuel's notebook, which she had taken to keeping on the bedside table. She opened it to the first blank page. She wrote in her careful and unadorned hand, "Day 1, warm, wood untouched." She did not celebrate. She did not feel the release of someone who has been lucky. She felt the particular quiet of someone who has tested a theory and found it correct, and who understands that the work is not finished, only begun. Outside, the Kansas wind moved across the prairie from the north, 500 miles of open country behind it, carrying the first real cold of what would become the hardest winter in a decade. Inside the Whitfield cabin, the quilts hung still. The warmth stayed. And Nora Whitfield, 28 years old, 7 weeks a widow, alone on a claim that everyone in Hartfield had already written off, picked up her pen and began calculating what came next. December came to Kansas the way it always did, without apology. The sky dropped low and gray over the prairie, pressing down on the homesteads and the bare fields and the frozen creek beds with the kind of weight that made the world feel smaller. The cottonwood trees along the creek lost their last leaves in a single night. The ground hardened to iron. And in the town of Hartfield, 12 miles east of the Whitfield claim, The women of the community gathered at wells and church doors and the counter of Gunderman's general store and talked about the widow on the Whitfield land. The story had gotten out the way stories always get out in small communities, imperfectly selectively shaped by the person doing the telling. Harriet Voss was doing most of the telling. She had a gift for it. She could take a fact and hold it at precisely the right angle so that the light fell on it the way she wanted, and the picture that emerged was always somehow the picture that confirmed what Harriet Voss had already decided was true. The fact was, this Nora Whitfield had hung her quilts on her walls. The picture Harriet made of it was this: a young widow, grief-addled and increasingly desperate, had taken leave of her domestic judgment and was now living inside what amounted to a fabric tent, burning through her limited firewood, while pretending that curtains could replace proper insulation. It was sad, really. It was the kind of thing that happened to women alone. It was the kind of thing that made you understand why a woman needed practical guidance through a Kansas winter. "She will be out of wood before Christmas," Harriet told Martha Gaines at the church door on the first Sunday of December. Martha Gaines nodded and told 3 people, and those 3 people told others, and by the second Sunday of December, the prediction had become a near certainty in the collective mind of Hartfield. The quilt widow, that was what they called her. Not with open cruelty, these were not cruel people, most of them, but with the particular mixture of pity and expectation that forms when a community has already decided how a story ends. There was one man who heard the name and said nothing. Amos Greer was 34 years old, a farmer whose land lay 3 miles north of the Whitfield claim. He had come to Kansas 2 years before from Ohio, buying the land cheap from a family that had given up after one hard season. He had not given up. He was not the kind of man who gave up, though he was also not the kind of man who announced this fact about himself. He was quiet in the way of people who have learned that most talking is a form of not listening, and he had decided early in his life that he preferred to listen. He heard the story of Nora Whitfield and her quilted walls. He filed it away. He did not form an opinion because he had not seen the thing himself, and Amos Greer did not form opinions about things he had not seen. He kept his own counsel. He watched the winter come in, and he paid attention in the way of a man who has learned that the details other people dismiss are often the ones that matter most. 3 weeks before Christmas, the temperature dropped to 10 below zero for 5 consecutive days. It was cold enough to freeze the water in the pitcher on Nora's bedside table by morning. Cold enough that the chickens clustered together in the corner of the coop in a single mass of feathers and warmth. Cold enough that the wood smoke from the homestead chimneys went straight up into the still air and hung there vertical and white, because even the wind had gone somewhere warmer. In every cabin in the Hartfield area, stoves burned continuously. Wood piles shrank. Families calculated and worried and sent the older boys out with axes in the early mornings to add to the dwindling stacks. In the Whitfield cabin, Nora kept the stove at medium. Not low, she was not foolish. At 10 below, even dead air has its limits, and she had learned in those first weeks that the system required a base level of heat to maintain itself. But medium, not high. Not the roaring fire that the cold demanded from every other homestead in the county. The quilts did their work, and the dead air did its work, and the small, steady fire was enough to keep the interior of the cabin at a temperature that allowed her to move without her coat during the middle of the day. She used the time she was not feeding the stove to do other things. She mended harness. She repaired a crack in the wall of the chicken coop with mud and straw, packing it tight the way Ingrid Larson had described packing the gaps in the cabin walls. She worked through Samuel's account book, going over the numbers for the land claim, with the precision of someone who understands that paperwork is a form of survival too. She wrote letters to the land office in Topeka, to Samuel's brother in Missouri, to her own mother in Pennsylvania, careful letters that mentioned none of the difficulty and all of the determination. In the evening, she wrote in Samuel's notebook, "Week 3, still at half cord, temperature 10 below, room temperature without coat manageable, north wall holding. Gap between canvas and east wall shrunk, refastened this morning. System requires maintenance." She was learning things, not just about insulation, about the nature of systems, about how the smallest failures accumulate into large ones if you do not catch them early, about the difference between a solution that works once and a solution that works consistently. The quilts needed checking every few days. The wool packing around the door frame needed replacing every 2 weeks. The airlock curtain required a weight at the bottom to keep it from swinging in the cross-draft when both doors were open at once. These were not discoveries she could have made by reading about dead air in a book, because there were no books about dead air in a Kansas homestead. She was making the knowledge as she went, the only way knowledge of that particular kind has ever been made by doing the thing and watching carefully and writing down what happened. It did not occur to her that this was extraordinary. It occurred to her only that it was necessary. The storm arrived in January without warning, which is the only way that storms on the open Kansas prairie ever arrive. There were signs in retrospect. The sky in the northwest had taken on a particular yellowish quality in the late afternoon of January the 8th. The temperature had risen slightly from the previous day's cold, which on the prairie often means worse weather is pushing the current weather out of the way. Nora's knees, which had become her most reliable meteorological instrument, had ached all morning with a deep insistence that she had learned to take seriously. She brought extra wood inside. She filled the water barrel from the pump before the pump could freeze. She made sure the chickens had extra feed and extra straw. She checked the hang of every quilt on every wall and retightened the ropes on two that had gone slightly slack. Then the storm came. It came from the northwest in the middle of the night, and by morning there was no outside anymore. There was only white in every direction, moving white wall after wall of it, the kind of blizzard that erases the distinction between sky and ground and fills every gap and hollow with the patience of something that has unlimited time. The wind was the kind of wind that has a voice. Not a howl, not a whistle, but a deep, continuous roar that became after 6 or 8 hours simply the sound of the world. Nora kept the stove fed and the inner curtain drawn, and she did not open the outer door except once each morning and once each evening, braced against the doorframe to check the drift levels and make sure the air vent for the stove was not blocked. The first day was difficult. The second day was worse. The third day was this day Rufus Dennett knocked on her door. Rufus Dennett was 62 years old, and he had been farming Kansas since before it was properly Kansas, since the territorial days when the land was cheap because it was hard, and the men who bought it were the kind who did not scare easily. He was a big man, slope-shouldered, with a face that had been shaped by 40 years of weather into something weatherproof itself. He had opinions about most things and shared them without invitation. And one of the opinions he had shared most freely in the past 2 months was his opinion about Nora Whitfield and her quilted walls. Foolishness, he had told his wife Mabel in November. Pure foolishness. Quilts do not stop cold. Fire stops cold. Wood stops cold. That woman does not have enough of either one. He had repeated versions of this opinion through December each time with the particular confidence of a man who has survived 40 Kansas winters and therefore considers himself to have arrived at definitive conclusions about what Kansas winters require. On the morning of January the 10th, the third day of the blizzard, Rufus Dennett ran out of firewood. It had not seemed possible. He had cut more wood than any winter previous 7 cords stacked along the north side of the barn, and he had burned through it with the absolute efficiency of a man who believes that the answer to cold is heat, and that the answer to more cold is more heat. The stove had roared for 3 days. The woodpile had become a memory, and now Rufus Dennett stood in his cold cabin looking at his cold wife and did the arithmetic that a man does when his assumptions have failed him. The nearest neighbor with wood to spare was the Whitfield place 2 miles south. Rufus put on every layer he owned and walked 2 miles through a blizzard. He knocked on the outer door of the Whitfield cabin. Then he pushed through it. Then he stopped because there was another curtain, heavy canvas, swinging gently, hanging in the space between the outer door and the main room. He pushed through that too and stepped inside. The warmth hit him like a physical thing. Not the brutal wall of heat you get from a roaring fire, the kind of warmth that scorches your near side while your back stays cold. This was a different kind of warmth entirely. It was even. It was everywhere in the room, distributed and settled the way warmth is in the middle of summer, when the whole world has had time to absorb and hold the heat. It was the warmth of a room that had been warm for a long time and intended to stay that way. The stove was burning low. Not low the way a stove burns when it is going out, but low the way a stove burns when it does not need to work very hard. A quiet, steady, modest fire, barely crackling. Rufus stood in the entryway and stared at it. "Mr. Dennett," Nora said from the table where she had been writing. She set down her pen and looked at him without surprise, because she had known someone would come. Eventually, the storm was too severe, and the woodpiles in this community were too confidently managed for no one to have run short. "Mrs. Whitfield," Rufus said. He looked around the room, the quilts on the walls, The canvas curtain he had just passed through, the low-burning stove, the impossible, unacceptable, undeniable fact that the room was warmer than his own cabin had been at any point in the past 3 days, with a fire that had consumed 7 cords of wood. "I have run short," he said. The words cost him something. You could hear what they cost him in the way he said them. "There is wood in the lean-to," Nora said. "Take what you need and bring back what you can spare in the spring." Rufus nodded. He did not move. He was still looking at the stove. "How much wood have you burned," he said slowly, "in the past 3 days?" Nora thought about it. "Approximately half a cord." He looked at her. "Half a cord in 3 days. "The system is efficient," she said. He was quiet for a long moment. The fire burned its quiet fire. Outside, the blizzard made its case against the walls of the cabin, and the walls wrapped in their quilts declined to be persuaded. "How?" Rufus Dennett said. And the thing that made that question remarkable, the thing that Nora understood immediately and that she would think about for years afterward, was not the question itself. It was the voice in which it was asked. Not demanding, not skeptical, not the voice of a man preparing to argue with the answer before he heard it. It was the voice of a man who had spent 62 years being certain about something and had just in the space of 30 seconds become uncertain. That is a specific kind of voice. It is rarer than it should be. And it requires a particular kind of courage, the kind that lives not in the dramatic moments, but in the quiet ones when a man has to decide whether his pride is worth more than the truth. Rufus Dennett had decided, and that decision Nora would think later was worth more than all the firewood in the lean-to. "Sit down," she said. "I will show you." She used the coffee cup. She poured a cup from the pot that had been sitting warm on the back of the stove all morning, barely needing the stove's heat to maintain its temperature in the insulated room. She set the cup on the table in front of Rufus. Steam rose from it in a thin column, drifting upward in the still air. "Watch the steam," she said. Rufus watched. "That steam is heat, visible heat. Heat does that. It rises, it moves, it goes away from the hot thing and into the air around it, and eventually it is gone. When moving air touches a hot surface, it takes heat away. That is why wind makes you colder than still air at the same temperature. The wind is constantly replacing the warm air near your skin with cold air. It steals the warmth before it can accumulate." Rufus nodded slowly. He knew this. Every farmer knows this. "Now," Nora said, "imagine that the coffee cup is your stove, and the cabin walls are the cold outside. The heat from the stove moves toward the cold walls. It moves through the walls and out into the air. That is where your 7 cords went, Mr. Dennett. Not into warming your family, into warming the Kansas prairie." Something shifted in the old farmer's expression. A slight tightening, as if a previously comfortable thought had just become uncomfortable. "Your 9 cords from previous winters did not fail you," she continued. "They just heated the open sky instead of the people inside. Every cord you burned went straight through those walls and out into the cold. The quilts stopped the heat from reaching the wall directly. But more important is the gap behind the quilts, 5 centimeters of air that cannot move, cannot circulate, cannot carry warmth away. Cold cannot pull heat through something that is perfectly still. The warmth accumulates. It stays." Rufus sat for a long time looking at the steam from his coffee cup, which had slowed and thinned as the coffee cooled in the warm room. "The curtain at the door," he said. "An airlock. Cold air from outside hits the inner curtain before it can reach the main room. 2 barriers instead of 1. Almost nothing gets through." Rufus drank his coffee. He looked at the walls. He looked at the ceiling, where Nora had tacked a length of canvas across the rafters, creating a low, false ceiling that trapped an additional layer of still air above the living space. He looked at the inner curtain, now pulled back to its resting position beside the door, and understood for the first time what it was for. "Who taught you this?" he said. "Ingrid Larson." A pause. "The Swedish woman past the creek." "Yes." Another pause. Longer. "I have never spoken to her." "Most people have not," Nora said. Rufus set down his cup. He stood up, a slow, deliberate process, the way a large man stands when his knees have opinions, and he looked at Nora Whitfield across the table with an expression she had not expected from him. It was not quite respect, or rather it was respect of a specific kind, the reluctant kind, which is the only kind that means anything. "I will bring the wood back in spring," he said. "I know you will." He went to the lean-to. He took what he needed. He walked back 2 miles through the blizzard, and he did not say another word about Nora Whitfield's quilted walls for the rest of that winter. But he was thinking about them. You could tell later from what he did in the spring. But that came later. The storm broke on January the 11th. The world reappeared white and silent and brutally bright. Nora dug out the cabin door. She dug out the path to the chicken coop. She fed the chickens who had survived in their straw-packed coop without significant distress, which she noted in Samuel's book with quiet satisfaction. She checked the woodpile, still more than half remaining. She did not feel triumphant. Triumph seemed like the wrong response to having done what needed to be done. She felt instead the steady satisfaction of a system working as designed. In the days that followed the storm, the silence that had descended on the Whitfield claim was a different silence from the one before it. Before the blizzard, the silence had been the silence of isolation, a woman alone in a cold place, running an experiment that the whole community expected to fail. After the blizzard, the silence had a different quality. It was the silence of something proved. Nora felt it, though she could not have explained exactly what had changed. She moved through her days with the same methodical care, the same early mornings and careful accounting and evening entries in the notebook. But something in the arithmetic of the situation had shifted. She had been tested by the worst the winter could offer, and she had come through it with her woodpile still more than half intact. The test had happened. The result was in. And results, unlike arguments, do not require anyone's agreement in order to be true. She had been visiting Ingrid regularly since the cough settled in for the winter, often enough that she knew the old woman's wood supply and the state of her quilts as well as she knew her own. Ingrid's cabin was everything the Whitfield cabin had become, but older and more practiced. The quilts on the walls were faded to near white in places, the canvas on the rafters was dark with years, and the airlock at the door had been there so long that its rope hinges had worn grooves into the doorframe. The cabin had the settled quality of a system that had not required significant adjustment in decades because it had been right from the beginning. On one of those February visits, helping Ingrid with the quilts on the east wall that had come slightly loose from their pegs, Nora asked the question she had been carrying since November. "Why did you not tell anyone else?" she said. "You have been here 20 years. You have known how to do this for 20 years. Why keep it to yourself?" Ingrid sat in her chair and considered the question with the unhurried seriousness she brought to all questions. "I did not keep it to myself," she said. "I told my husband first the year we arrived. He thought it was women's work and did not implement it. He died that winter." She was quiet for a moment. "I told the Hendersons 2 years after I arrived. Mrs. Henderson thought it was a good idea and mentioned it to her husband. Her husband thought it was foreign nonsense. They lost 2 cords more than they needed to that winter, but were otherwise fine." She shifted in her chair. Outside, the February wind made its case against the walls, and the walls, wrapped in their quilts, declined to be persuaded. "You stop telling people," Ingrid said. "When people stop listening, it is not bitterness, it is efficiency. I kept my cabin warm. That was what I could do." Nora tightened the last rope and stepped back to check the gap. 5 centimeters clean and even. She thought about the difference between knowledge that stays inside one person and knowledge that moves outward through a community, slowly at first, then when the conditions are right all at once. Ingrid had kept this knowledge for 20 years in a county that never thought to ask for it. That was not a failure of generosity. That was a failure of listening on the community's part, and Nora had no intention of letting it continue. She was still thinking about this when she rode home in the late afternoon, the cold air sharp against her face, and found a wagon outside her cabin that she did not recognize. 3 weeks later, in early February, the Women's Auxiliary of the First Methodist Church of Hartfield held its monthly meeting in the back room of the church, and Harriet Voss called the gathering to order with the particular air of a woman who has been waiting for just this moment. The matter she announced was the situation of Mrs. Nora Whitfield. She laid it out with precision. A young widow, isolated, insufficient resources, increasingly irregular domestic arrangements, and here she paused to allow the image of the quilted walls to do its own work in the imagination of the assembled women, several of whom had heard the story enough times to have formed vivid pictures. The auxiliary Harriet proposed had a responsibility, A formal approach to Mrs. Whitfield, offering assistance in the form of coordinated support food firewood. Practical help in finding a more sustainable arrangement for the coming year was not charity. It was Christian duty. She looked around the room with the expression of a woman who expects agreement. Mabel Dennett spoke. She was a quiet woman, usually. She knitted during meetings, her hands always moving, her contributions to discussions few and carefully chosen. She set her knitting down now, and when she spoke, her voice was even and completely without theatrics, which made it more effective than theatrics would have been. My husband, she said, spent the night of January the 10th in the Whitfield cabin. The room went still. He ran out of wood during the blizzard. He walked 2 miles in the storm to ask for help. She paused. He came home the next morning warm and thoughtful. He told me the cabin was the warmest place he had been all winter. He told me the stove was barely burning. He told me he had been wrong about Mrs. Whitfield. She picked up her knitting. Rufus has farmed Kansas for 40 years, she said. He is not a man who says he has been wrong about things. The room remained quiet for a moment. Then it began to shift, the soft sound of one set of certainties quietly making room for another. Glances exchanged, chairs adjusted. The particular subtle atmosphere change of a group of people who have just realized that the story they have been telling each other may not be the whole story. Harriet Voss waited for the room to settle. Her face had not changed. She was a woman who had learned to keep her face steady when things were not going as planned, and she deployed this skill now with considerable discipline. One man's experience, she said carefully, during a moment of difficulty does not. How much wood have you burned this winter, Harriet? Said a voice from the back of the room. It was Ruth Calder who ran the school and was not a member of the auxiliary in any formal sense, but attended meetings anyway because she found them useful. Harriet turned slightly toward the voice. I do not see how that is. I am curious, Ruth said pleasantly, for comparison. The silence that followed had a different quality than the previous one. Harriet looked around the room and found to her considerable discomfort that she could not locate in it the universal support she had expected. 8 cords, she said finally. Approximately. The Reverend burns 11 for the church, someone said from the side of the room. It is a large building, Harriet said. Mrs. Whitfield. Mabel Dennett said, her hands still moving on the knitting, her voice still perfectly even, has burned fewer than 4, in the coldest winter in 10 years. The meeting continued for another 40 minutes. Harriet managed it with skill and determination and got the resolution she wanted: a formal offer of auxiliary support to Mrs. Whitfield to be delivered in a manner that preserved the widow's dignity. It was a compromise, and Harriet was good at making compromises look like victories. But she sat through those 40 minutes knowing something she had not known when she called the meeting to order. She was not controlling this anymore. She had been so absolutely certain, so foundationally certain, that Nora Whitfield would fail before Christmas, that she had prepared for no other outcome. And now it was February, the coldest month, and the widow was still there. She kept her face still. She managed the meeting. She drove home in the cold. The last week of February came in savage and sharp, the way February in Kansas often saves its worst for the end, as if the month is making a final argument before surrendering to March. Nora had developed a routine that was almost meditative in its regularity. Morning, check the quilts, check the door, packing note, the overnight temperature in the notebook. Feed the chickens, feed the stove, 1 measured load of wood, and let the system do the rest. Afternoon, the work of the claim. Evening, a small fire. A cup of tea, the notebook. The entries had become a record of something she had not anticipated recording. February 3rd. Wind northeast severe. Interior temperature with stove at medium comfortable without coat. Exterior estimated 15 below. North wall showing no cold transfer. System holding. February 9th. Checked wood supply. 3 3/4 cords remaining. Usage this winter to date approximately 4 cords. Samuel and I used 8 cords our first winter together, both of us maintaining the stove. Conclusion system performing beyond initial estimate. February 14th. Ingrid came by, still coughing. Made her stay for lunch and would not hear otherwise. She told me about the winter she was 9 years old in Uppsala when the harbor froze for the first time in 20 years, and the dead air in the walls of her family's house was the reason they survived it. The notebook was nearly full. She had been keeping it since November, and what had begun as a simple record of firewood consumption had become something more, a document of the mechanics of warmth, with observations and adjustments and variations, noted with the care that the subject deserved. She was going to need to buy more notebooks. She was thinking about this, about the notebooks, about what she intended to do with what was in them, about the question of knowledge and how it moves when she pulled up to her cabin in the late afternoon of February 22nd and found a wagon outside it. A good wagon, well-maintained. A bay horse she did not recognize standing patient in the cold. She climbed down from her own wagon. She went inside. Harriet Voss was standing in the middle of the quilted room. She had not sat down. She stood with her hands folded in front of her and her back very straight, and she was looking at the room with the expression of a woman who has heard a number and is now for the first time standing inside it. That was the difference from the women's auxiliary meeting. In the church room 3 weeks ago, Harriet had heard Mabel Dennett say 4 chords against her own 9, and she had managed the information from a careful distance, the way she managed most unwelcome information by filing it somewhere it could not require anything of her. But hearing a number and standing inside the proof of it are different things entirely. The warmth of the cabin was not abstract. It was immediate and physical and completely inconsistent with the stove she could see from where she stood, a small low-burning fire that should not have been capable of maintaining this temperature in a Kansas February. The coffee pot on the back of the stove, the absence of any draft, the quilts hanging still and purposeful on every wall. She turned when Nora came in. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Nora took off her coat, then she took off her heavy wool overshirt, leaving only her cotton work dress, because the room was warm enough that the overshirt was not necessary. Harriet Voss watched her do this. "How much wood?" she said. Her voice was different from the last time Nora had heard it. Smaller, stripped of its usual weight of certainty. "Just over 4 chords for the winter," Nora said. "Through the end of February." Harriet's jaw tightened slightly. "I have burned 9. I know. The Reverend has burned 11 for the church. I know that too." Nora went to the stove. She picked up the coffee pot, which was warm because the room was warm, and the room was warm because the dead air was doing its work, and she poured 2 cups. She set one on the table and gestured toward the chair. Harriet Voss sat down. She sat in the warm room and she drank the warm coffee and she looked at the quilts that had once belonged to a grandmother and a mother and a honeymoon trip to Wichita, now hanging 5 centimeters from every wall, doing the thing that Harriet had told everyone they were incapable of doing. She did not apologize. Nora had not expected her to. She did not say she had been wrong. Nora had not expected that either. What she did was sit and drink and look at the room around her, with the expression of a woman who is quietly, privately, and for the first time in a long while, revising something fundamental about the map she has been using to navigate the world. That was enough. More than enough. "The quilts," Harriet said eventually. Not a question. An acknowledgement, the kind you make when you have run out of the words you plan to use. "The quilts," Nora agreed. The fire burned. Outside, the last of the February wind dragged itself across the Kansas prairie and spent itself against the walls of a cabin that had decided on a November morning not to give the cold what it wanted. Harriet Voss finished her coffee. She set the cup down on the table with that same small, precise click as always. She stood. She put on her coat. At the door she paused with her hand on the handle of the inner curtain. She did not turn around, but she stood there a moment longer than was necessary for the purpose of leaving. In that extra moment, Nora understood something. Harriet would not become an ally. She would not announce to the community that she had been wrong. She would not stand at the front of the church and recant her predictions with the public honesty of a converted skeptic. But she would stop predicting failure. She would stop organizing the community around the expectation of a widow's collapse. She would redirect her considerable energy toward other matters, and she would do so in the way of people who have been proved wrong without acknowledgement, without drama, simply by pointing themselves in a different direction and never mentioning the previous one. And in the community of Hartfield, Kansas, where Harriet Voss's attention was a resource that could be pointed like a lamp, that redirection was going to matter. She pushed through the inner curtain. She pushed through the outer door. She was gone. Nora stood alone in the warm room, listening to the sounds of the wagon turning in the yard and the horse's hooves receding down the track. Then she went to the table. She opened Samuel's notebook. She turned to the day's entry. She wrote, February 22nd, HV came. Saturday. Drank coffee. Did not speak much. Left without prediction. She looked at that last line for a moment. Left without prediction. She understood what that meant. She had won something. Not the argument. She had never needed to win the argument. She had won the winter. And the winter was the only argument that had ever mattered. She closed the notebook. She fed a small log into the stove. She looked at the walls, at the quilts, at the dead air spaces behind them, at the accumulated understanding of 3 generations of Swedish winters, made practical and proven on a Kansas claim by a woman who had decided in the worst week of her life not to ask permission to survive. The warmth held. It had held all winter. And now outside, past the frozen creek and the bare cottonwoods and the long gray miles of prairie spring, was beginning its slow and patient approach. It was going to find her here on her claim, with her woodpile still carrying 3 cords into March. Her notebook full of data and her walls covered in quilts that everyone had told her were foolish and that had turned out to be the most practical things she owned. Spring was coming, and Nora Whitfield had things to teach. Spring came to Kansas the way it always does, not as an arrival but as a slow negotiation. The frost did not leave the ground all at once. It retreated in stages, giving up a 1/4 inch at a time, the way a difficult argument concedes a point, partially grudgingly, always suggesting it might return. The creek thawed and refroze twice before it committed to running. The cottonwoods put out tentative buds, reconsidered, and tried again. The prairie, which in winter had seemed like a place that had forgotten it was ever alive, began slowly and without ceremony to remember. Nora Whitfield watched it happen from the south window of her cabin, the one with the quilt she pulled aside each morning to let the light in. She had survived the winter. She let that fact settle into her the way heat settles into a well-insulated room, slowly, evenly, without drama. She did not celebrate in any outward way. She did not feel the need. The proof was in the woodpile still carrying 3 cords of unburned wood into March. The proof was in the land claim documents she had continued filing through the worst months. The proof was in the notebook on the table, page after page, of careful entries recording temperatures and wood consumption and the small technical adjustments that had kept the system working through the hardest winter in a decade. She had survived. The claim was intact, and she had done it with half the firewood that every other homestead in the county had considered the bare minimum. She was thinking about what to do with that fact when Rufus Dennett came to return the wood. He arrived on a Thursday morning in late March with a wagon loaded with more wood than he had taken, which was not something Nora had expected, but which was, she thought, very much in keeping with the man she had begun to understand Rufus Dennett to be, a man who, once he had decided something, committed to it with the same total energy he had previously committed to the opposite position. He unloaded the wood without ceremony. Nora brought out coffee, and they stood beside the lean-to in the thin spring sunlight and drank it, and Rufus looked at the cabin with the expression he had worn, she suspected, since January, the expression of a man who is quietly and continuously revising something large. "I have been thinking," he said. "I know," Nora said. He glanced at her sideways. "The barn runs cold. Always has. I lose heat in the barn. The animals do not put on condition the way they should. They need more feed to maintain weight through the winter. Feed costs money. Always thought it was just the nature of barns." "It does not have to be," Nora said. "No," Rufus said. "I am beginning to understand that." He was quiet for a moment. Canvas, heavy canvas, hung 5 centimeters from the wall. "And the gaps in the boards need packing first," Nora said. "The canvas without the packing still lets cold through the gaps. The dead air is the second layer, not the first. Both layers together is what gives you the result." Rufus nodded slowly. He was absorbing this the way he absorbed everything, not quickly but completely, the way good soil takes in rain after a long dry spell. "I am going to try it this fall," he said. "In the barn. Let me know what you find," Nora said. "I want to know if it behaves differently in a larger space." Rufus looked at her then. "You are keeping records." "Yes." "What for?" Nora considered the question. Outside, a meadowlark somewhere in the new grass made its first tentative spring declaration, the sound carrying clearly in the still air. "Because knowledge that is not written down dies with the person who holds it," she said. "And this is knowledge that keeps people alive." Rufus Dennett finished his coffee. He set the cup on the wagon board. He picked up his reins. Ingrid Larson, he said. The Swedish woman. Yes. I should have talked to her 20 years ago. Yes, Nora said. You should have. He drove away. Nora watched the wagon until it was a dark shape against the greening prairie, then went inside and wrote the conversation in Samuel's notebook, because that was what she did now with things that mattered. The knowledge moved the way warmth moves in a well-insulated room. Not in a rush, not in a flood. Gradually, steadily from one point of contact to the next, with the patience of something that does not need to announce itself because it works. Rufus Dennett did not stand up in church and declare that Nora Whitfield had been right and he had been wrong. He did not write a letter to the Hartfield Courier. He did not make a speech at the grain exchange or organize a demonstration at the county fair. He hung canvas in his barn that fall 5 centimeters from the walls with the gaps packed first. His cattle went into winter carrying better condition than they had in years. His feed bill dropped by a third. His neighbors noticed on the prairie, you notice a man's cattle when they look better than yours, and you ask about it because you are a practical person, and this is a practical matter. And Rufus Dennett, who had never had difficulty saying what he thought, told them exactly what he had done and exactly where he had learned it. 6 families hung fabric that first spring and summer before the following winter. Some came to Nora directly. Some heard it from Rufus. Some heard it from Mabel Dennett, who had incorporated it into her ordinary conversation the way you incorporate any fact that has proved itself without drama, simply as a thing that is true and therefore worth sharing. Ingrid Larson came with some of them. She would arrive at a homestead with Nora moving slowly with her cane, but with perfect alertness, and she would walk the walls of the cabin with her hand held 5 centimeters from the timber, feeling for drafts, identifying gaps. She would draw diagrams in the earth with a stick, the cross-section of a wall with the fabric hanging free of it, the airlock configuration at the door, the low false ceiling that added another layer of still air above the living space. She explained in her accented English, and Nora translated the technical details into the plain Kansas vernacular that her neighbors understood, and between them they taught 6 families in the first season what had taken Nora a November afternoon to learn. It was during one of these visits in the early summer of 1885 that Amos Greer appeared. He was at the Harker place 3 miles north of Nora's claim on the day she and Ingrid came to help the Harkers insulate their front room. He had come to help Harker with a fence repair and was still there when Nora arrived, and he did what he always did, found a quiet position from which to observe without intruding. Nora noticed him the way you notice a still thing in a moving scene by its contrast to everything around it. He was standing near the barn door holding a fence post, watching Ingrid draw her diagrams in the earth while the Harker family crowded around. He was not skeptical the way several of the men nearby were skeptical. He was not dismissive. He was paying attention with the specific quality of someone who is trying to understand something completely which is different from the way most people pay attention. She did not speak to him that day. There was too much work. But she thought about him on the ride home with Ingrid dozing in the wagon seat beside her, the old woman's silver head tipping gently with the motion of the wheels. She thought about the quality of his attention, which had been, without his saying a single word, the most respectful thing in the yard. She saw him 3 more times that summer, always at a distance, always in the context of other work. He came to a second teaching visit at the Caldecott place in July, and this time he asked one question, just one at the end when most people had dispersed. The ceiling layer, he said to Nora. You hang fabric across the rafters. Does the weight matter? Does the fabric need to be heavy to hold the dead air in place above it? It was a good question. It was the kind of question that could only come from someone who had been listening carefully enough to understand the principle rather than just the procedure. The weight matters less than the coverage, Nora said. Gaps let air circulate. Complete coverage is what creates the still layer. I use lightweight canvas on the ceiling because it is easier to manage over a large area, and it works just as well. Amos Greer nodded. Thank you, he said. He went back to his wagon. He drove away. Nora watched him go and thought about his question for the rest of the afternoon. By the fall of 1886, 12 more families had insulated their homes. By the winter of 1887, half the homesteads in the Hartfield area were using some version of the dead air method. The variations were interesting. Some families used canvas instead of quilts, which was cheaper but slightly less effective on the coldest nights. Some added a third layer on the north wall, which Nora's data suggested improved performance by approximately 15% in severe conditions. One family, the Wentworths, had applied the principle to their root cellar hanging canvas from the ceiling joists and found that their vegetables kept through the winter without the usual losses to freezing. Nora wrote all of it down. Samuel's first notebook had filled by November of 1885. She had bought 3 more from Gunderman's general store, Franklin Gunderman, who had begun stocking heavier canvas duck cloth after noticing an unusual increase in demand, and who had asked Nora once, with the careful neutrality of a good merchant, what exactly people were doing with so much heavy canvas. She had told him. He had listened. He had nodded. 2 weeks later, she noticed that he had hung canvas on the north wall of the store, 5 centimeters from the timber with the gaps packed with wool. He never said a word to her about it. But the store was noticeably warmer that winter, and he sold more heavy canvas than he had sold in the previous 5 years combined. Harriet Voss, for her part, said nothing about any of it. She had not visited the Whitfield cabin since February of 1885. She had not made another prediction about Nora's future. She had redirected the energies of the Women's Auxiliary toward a roof repair campaign for the schoolhouse, which was a genuine need and which Harriet pursued with the same total commitment she brought to everything, and the subject of the Whitfield widow and her quilted walls simply ceased by unspoken consensus to be a topic at auxiliary meetings. The community moved on. The knowledge moved with it. Ingrid Larson's cough did not improve with the spring of 1885. It improved somewhat in the summer, enough that Nora stopped counting the days between visits, enough that the old woman was able to make her walking rounds of the homesteads through the fall. But by the winter of 1886, it had returned with more authority, and by the winter of 1887, it had become the kind of persistent resident that does not leave when asked. Nora visited every week through that last winter. Sometimes she brought food. Sometimes she brought nothing but herself, sitting in the chair across from Ingrid's chair by the stove, in the warm cabin the old woman had insulated 40 years before, in a country that was not her own, using knowledge that her mother had given her in a cold Swedish house before everything changed. They talked about the things the two of them talked about, the technical details of insulation always, but also the other forms of warmth, the ones harder to measure. Ingrid talked about her husband who had died in that first Kansas winter before they had finished preparing the cabin. She talked about Uppsala, about the particular quality of winter light there, about her mother's hands cutting fabric with the precision of someone who understood that getting the measurement right was the difference between living and not living. She talked about the 300 years of accumulated cold weather knowledge that had produced what she carried in her memory, knowledge built by generations of people in hard places who could not afford to be wrong. In Sweden, Ingrid said one evening in March of 1888, her voice thinner than it had been but still clear, "We say that the cold is a teacher, a harsh teacher, but honest." Nora was checking the east wall quilt, rethreading the hanging rope that had frayed. "What does it teach?" "That you cannot win against what is real," Ingrid said. "Cold is real. You cannot argue with it. You cannot persuade it. You cannot outlast it with willpower alone. You have to understand it, what it needs in order to come inside, and then you take that thing away." She paused. Most people spend their whole lives fighting what is real. They wear themselves out. They exhaust their resources, and the cold is still there in the morning. Nora tied off the rope. She tested the tension. She stepped back to check the 5-centimeter gap. "You understand it instead," she said. "You understand it instead," Ingrid said, "and then it loses its power over you. Not because you have defeated it, because you have stopped giving it what it requires." Nora sat back down in the other chair. She looked at the old woman across the stove, at the silver braids loose on her shoulders, at the hands wrapped around the cup, at the face that had been shaped by 70 years into something that had arrived at peace by a route that had included considerable difficulty. "You taught me that," Nora said. "You already understood it," Ingrid said. "You understood it the day you sat down next to me in Gunderman's. A woman who did not already know that principle would not have asked the questions you asked." Nora thought about that. Outside, the March wind moved across the Kansas prairie, but it moved across a landscape that was no longer entirely what it had been 4 years ago. In 6 homesteads, in 12, and half the claims in the county fabric hung 5 centimeters from the timber. Still air sat in 1,000 small spaces between fabric and wall, doing nothing, and in doing nothing, holding warmth that would otherwise have fled into the cold. Ingrid Larson died on the 10th of April, 1888. She died in the morning, in the chair she preferred to her bed in the warm cabin she had insulated 4 decades before with knowledge her mother had given her in Uppsala. The cough had been replaced in those last days by a quiet that was different from her ordinary quiet, deeper, more complete, the quiet of something that has finished what it came to do. Nora was there. She had arrived the previous afternoon when Ingrid had sent word through the boy who delivered mail that company would be welcome. She had sat through the night in the other chair, and she had been awake when the old woman's breathing slowed and became the particular stillness that is not sleep. She sat with her for a long time after. Then she went outside into the April morning cold and bright smelling of new earth and the creek running clear for the first time since October, and she stood at the edge of Ingrid's small yard and looked at the Kansas sky, which was the pale and enormous blue of early spring, and she said nothing. There was nothing to say that would improve on the silence. She went home. She opened Samuel's notebook to a new page. She wrote, April 10th, 1888. Ingrid Larson died this morning. She was 71 years old. She came from Uppsala, Sweden, and she knew things that this community would have been better for knowing sooner. She taught me how to keep warm. I intend to make sure the teaching does not end with her. Amos Greer came to the funeral. He stood at the back of the small gathering at the churchyard. Nora had arranged for Ingrid to be buried there, working through the initial hesitation of Reverend Voss, who had been persuaded by his wife in a private conversation, whose details the historical record does not contain, but whose outcome was evident, and he held his hat in his hands and listened to the brief service with the same quality of attention she had noticed in the Harker yard 3 years before. Afterward, when most people had dispersed, he came to where Nora was standing beside the grave. I never spoke to her, he said. I should have. Yes, Nora said, you should have. He was quiet for a moment. Then, she taught you what you know about insulation. She gave me the principle. I worked out how to apply it. There is a difference, Amos said. A large one, Nora said. He nodded. He put his hat back on. He looked at the small stone Nora had commissioned Ingrid Larson 1818 to 1888. She understood warmth, and he seemed to be turning something over in his mind. I came by your place last fall, he said. You were not home. I wanted to ask about the ceiling application, the canvas across the rafters. You could have left a note. I could have. A pause. I was not sure you would want to be bothered. Nora looked at him. He was a direct man and a careful one, and the combination produced a kind of plainness she had come over 3 years of peripheral observation to find genuinely restful. He did not say things for effect. He did not perform modesty or confidence. He simply occupied his own position in the world with the uncomplicated steadiness of someone who has made peace with who he is. I am never bothered by good questions, she said. He looked at her. Then I have some. They walked back from the churchyard in the April light, and he asked about the ceiling canvas, about the performance difference between quilted fabric and plain canvas, about whether the principle could be applied to a root cellar with curved stone walls where hanging fabric straight was difficult. She answered each question. She asked her own questions about his barn, which Rufus had mentioned in passing, about whether the cattle had performed differently in the insulated sections versus the uninsulated ones. He had data. He had been keeping records. Nora stopped walking. She looked at him. You have been tracking it. Since the first fall I tried it, he said. Feed consumption per animal weight through winter calf condition in spring, compared against the 3 years before. He paused. The insulated section shows a 22% reduction in feed required to maintain weight. The uninsulated section shows no change. Nora was quiet for a moment. I want to see those records. They are in a book, he said. In the barn. Of course they are, she said. He came to the Whitfield cabin the following week with the record book. It was a plain brown ledger, the same kind that Gunderman sold for account keeping, filled with careful, unadorned handwriting columns of figures, dates, observations, comparisons across seasons. He set it on the table beside Samuel's notebooks, and they sat across from each other and went through both sets of records together. And it was the most genuinely interesting conversation Nora had had in 4 years of managing the claim alone. Not only because of the subject, though, the subject was genuinely interesting. 2 independent applications of the same principle. The data from both pointing in the same direction with the particular satisfaction that comes from results that confirm each other without having been coordinated. But because of the quality of his attention, which was the same in conversation as it was at a distance, complete, unperforming, present in a way that did not require the other person to fill the silence or manage his comfort. It had been a long time since Nora had sat across a table from someone who listened the way Amos Greer listened. He stayed for 3 hours. He left when the light was going. At the door with his coat on and his hat in his hand, he stopped. "The south room," he said. "I noticed the framing started on a south addition." "I have been trying to add a room for 2 years," Nora said. "I do not have the lumber finished, and I am not a carpenter." "I am a carpenter," he said. "Not a boast. A fact offered in the same plain register as everything else," he said. Nora looked at him. "I could finish the framing," he said, "in exchange for your help with the insulation on the east wall of my barn. There is a section I cannot get right." It was the most practical proposal she had ever received. It was also, she understood, something more than a trade of labor offered by a man who had been observing her from a careful distance for 3 years and had decided in the deliberate way of a man who takes his time but commits fully when he decides that this was the moment. "Come Saturday," she said. "I will have the measurements ready." He nodded. He put on his hat. He went down the steps to his wagon. Nora stood in the doorway and watched him go. She thought about what Ingrid had said, that you cannot win against what is real, that the better approach is understanding it. She thought about Samuel, who had known her well enough to give her permission in advance for whatever she needed to do. She thought about the 4 years between then and now, and everything she had built in them, and everything she still intended to build. Amos Greer was real. That was what she was thinking. He was real in the specific way of things that have been tested by time and found to be exactly what they appear to be. She went back inside. She opened the notebook. April 18th, 1888. Amos Greer came with his records. 22% feed reduction in insulated barn section confirmed over 3 seasons. His data and mine are consistent. He is coming Saturday to help with the south room framing. She looked at the last line for a moment. She added, "He keeps records." That is not a small thing. They were married in the spring of 1889. It was a plain ceremony at the First Methodist Church of Hartfield, with Reverend Voss officiating, and Mabel Dennett standing as witness, and Rufus Dennett sitting in the front pew, looking approximately as emotional as a man of his constitution was capable of appearing in public, which was to say his jaw was set at a slightly softer angle than usual. Harriet Voss attended. She sat 4 rows back on the left side, her back straight, her hat precise, her face expressing the dignified neutrality of a woman who has decided that this particular development does not require commentary. She did not speak to Nora before the ceremony. She did not speak to her after. But she came, and in the community of Hartfield, Kansas, in the spring of 1889, Harriet Voss's presence at a thing was a form of acknowledgement that carried its own weight. Nora noticed. She did not say anything about it, but she noticed. Amos moved into the Whitfield cabin, which by then had the south room completed, and a new airlock configuration at the front entrance that Amos had engineered with a carpenter's precision, solving a cross-draft problem that Nora had never managed to eliminate. He brought his ledger books. He brought his tools. He brought a quietness that settled into the cabin alongside the warmth of the dead air spaces and became, Nora found, indistinguishable from it. Simply a quality of the place present and reliable. They worked the claim together. They added acreage in 1891 and 1893. They had 5 children, 3 boys and 2 girls, all of whom grew up in a house where the walls were covered in quilts, where the fire burned low and steady, where winter was not an emergency, but a condition you understood and therefore managed. The children learned it the way children learn the things that are simply part of the household, not as a lesson, but as the texture of daily life. They learned to check the quilt gaps. They learned to close the inner curtain before the outer door. They learned that warmth is something you keep, not something you generate, in greater and greater quantities, and that the difference between those two approaches is the difference between having enough and running out. Nora kept the notebooks going. By 1887, she had 4. By 1895, she had 11, covering not just insulation data, but the variations that different families had developed. The root cellar applications, the barn adaptations, the modifications for different wall thicknesses and different climate exposures. She had begun by the early 1890s to receive letters from homesteaders in Nebraska and Colorado, and the Dakota Territories forwarded through Gundermans, asking about the method they had heard referred to as the Whitfield system, or the Kansas insulation method, or most commonly and most accurately the Swedish way. She answered every letter. She included diagrams. The knowledge moved. It moved steadily from one point of contact to the next, filling in where the cold had been. Rufus Dennett died in 1901 at the age of 79, which was a longer life than most men of his generation managed on the Kansas prairie, and which his doctor attributed in part to the fact that he had spent the last 16 winters in a properly insulated house that did not require him to feed a roaring stove around the clock in order to avoid freezing. Mabel outlived him by 11 years. She spent part of that time visiting homesteads with younger women, teaching what she had learned from Nora, who had learned it from Ingrid, who had learned it from her mother in Uppsala before the harbor froze. The chain held. The knowledge did not die with any single person. That had been Nora's intention from the moment she wrote the first entry in Samuel's notebook, and she had executed it with the same methodical care she brought to everything. Harriet Voss died in 1907. The obituary in the Hartfield Courier mentioned her decades of service to the Women's Auxiliary, her fundraising for the schoolhouse roof, her commitment to the community's welfare. Nora attended the funeral because attending the funeral of someone who was part of your life, even the difficult parts, is the right thing to do, and Nora had always been more interested in doing the right thing than in being seen to do it. She stood at the graveside in the October cold and thought about that February afternoon in 1885 when Harriet had sat in the warm cabin and drunk the coffee and set the cup down with that small, precise click and left without prediction. She thought about the particular kind of courage it takes to revise yourself without announcing the revision. It is not a dramatic courage. It does not make good stories. But it is real, and it is more common than it deserves credit for being, and Harriet Voss had possessed it even if she had exercised it privately and without acknowledgement. Nora said a prayer for her, a genuine one. The cabin stood until 1923. By then it was old in the way that wooden structures get old in Kansas, not dramatically, not suddenly, but through the accumulation of seasons, each one taking something small, until the sum of the small things became a structural argument for starting over. The logs had settled, the foundation had shifted. The roof, which Amos had replaced twice, was ready to come off a third time. They built the new house on the same ground. Frame construction, proper insulation, built into the walls from the beginning, the principle absorbed so completely into the design that it was invisible. The way the best ideas eventually become invisible, becoming simply the correct way to do things, the baseline assumption from which everyone works. Before the old cabin came down, Nora went through it one last time. She walked each room slowly. She touched the walls, the log timber dark with 40 years of smoke and weather, the wooden pegs she had driven in that November morning in 1884, still holding their positions, some original, some replaced over the years, the surviving ones worn smooth by decades of rope friction. She took Samuel's notebooks, all 11 of them wrapped in oilcloth. She took Amos's ledger books. She took the tools, and she took the quilt. Her grandmother's quilt, the blue and cream and pale yellow one, the one that was 40 years old when she first hung it on the north wall in November of 1884, and was now 60 years old, the colors faded to a softness that was almost luminous. It had hung on that north wall for 38 years. It had done its work without complaint. It had been part of the system that kept 5 children warm through their childhoods, that kept 2 adults alive through the hardest winter, in a decade that had helped keep half a county from burning through more firewood than necessary for the better part of 20 years. She folded it with care. She put it in the cedar chest that had been her mother's. Nora Whitfield Greer lived to be 71 years old. She died in the spring of 1927 in the new house on the old ground in the south room that Amos had framed in the summer of 1888 as his first contribution to what would become their life together. Amos outlived her by 4 years, which he spent largely in the company of their children and grandchildren, continuing to keep records in a new ledger. He had started the year they built the new house, tracking the performance of modern insulation against the dead air systems of the old cabin, with the conscientiousness of a man who has never stopped being interested in the data. The notebooks went to the eldest daughter, Clara, who understood their value and kept them carefully. The ledger books went to the eldest son, Thomas, who farmed the land for another 30 years. The tools went to the boys who could use them. The quilt, the blue and cream and pale yellow one faded soft by 60 years of doing its work, went to the Kansas Historical Society in 1931, donated by the family with a letter written in Clara's hand explaining its history. The society's curator wrote back expressing gratitude and noting that the quilt would be displayed alongside other artifacts of frontier domestic life. It is there still. The display card reads, "Quilt circa 1844, cotton batting hand-stitched." This quilt was used by Nora Whitfield, 1856 to 1927, as wall insulation in her Kansas homestead during the winter of 1884 to 1885. Whitfield developed and popularized the dead air insulation method, trapping still air between fabric and wall to prevent heat transfer based on principles brought to the American plains by Scandinavian immigrant communities. The method, which reduced firewood consumption by approximately 50% in documented cases, spread through the Hartfield, Kansas area between 1885 and 1890 and was subsequently adopted across multiple prairie states. Whitfield documented her results and those of neighboring households in 11 handwritten notebooks now held in the Society's archive. She refused to abandon her land claim in the winter of 1884 when her entire community expected her to. She did not fail. There is one thing worth saying after all of it. We spend most of our lives trying to generate warmth, more fire, more effort, more fuel burned against the cold. We treat warmth as something we produce by force, something that requires constant and escalating input to maintain. We build bigger fires. We cut more wood. We fight. Nora Whitfield understood it differently. Warmth is not made. Warmth is kept. The fire produces it. The body produces it. But keeping it is the separate skill and the harder one. You find where the heat goes. You stop it there. You find where the cold enters. You put something in its way. Still air, dead air, air that does nothing and in doing nothing holds everything. She learned this about her cabin walls in the worst winter of her life from a Swedish woman in the corner of a general store whom the whole community had decided was not worth knowing. She spent the next 40 years proving it true, teaching it, writing it down, and making sure it did not die with her. The quilt is in the museum. The notebooks are in the archive. The principle is in every insulated wall in every house in the country. Invisible, now foundational, so thoroughly absorbed into the correct way of building that no one thinks about where it came from or what it cost to figure out, or who figured it out alone in a Kansas winter, with the woodpile shrinking and the community predicting her failure and the wind coming down from the north without pause. She figured it out anyway. She wrote it down. She made sure it kept going. That is what she left behind.